This is one of my very favorite hymns, although I don't know it very well. Oh Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made, I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, thy power throughout the universe display. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then when through the woods and forest glades I wander, and hear the birds sing sweetly in the trees, when I look down from lofty mountain grandeur, and hear the brook, and feel a gentle breeze, then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. And when I think that God his Son would not sparing, sent him to die, I scarce can take it in, that on the cross my burden gladly bearing, he bled and died to take away my sin. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. When Christ shall come with shout of exclamation, and take me home, what joy shall fill my heart. Within I shall bow in humble adoration, and there proclaim, my God, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my God to thee. How great thou art! How great thou art! Then sings my soul, my Savior God to thee. How great thou art! How great thou art! Oh, thou. Thomas built a home in Santa Clara for his family. The children used to laugh to think that their neighbors along the street were named Brown, Crow, Lay, Hatch, Night, and Day. Grandma, while there with her siblings, used to delight in going across the street to Crow's yard to make spearmint tea and eat bread and molasses. Thomas's second wife was extremely ambitious and insisted upon uncomplaining industry from her own as well as her foster children. Soon after they were established in Santa Clara, she took the three oldest girls, Belle, Nettie, and Mariamne, to Salt Lake City, where they learned the glove-making and tailoring trade. They had a little home there, and they returned year after year. She had a leaching machine to make lye from ashes. Fat was secured from the tithing office and soap made for half. Thousands of pounds were made and sold, the money being used to help equip her husband Thomas's mill with the necessary machinery. My grandmother was, as a young girl, with her long, hard hours, part of this work. In 1865, a one-room cabin was built at the mill, and the family lived there in the summer to be able to cook and care for mill workers. The cabin had a roof of willows and mud, and was inhabited by snakes, scorpions, centipedes, etc. One evening my grandmother started to walk across the floor when something bit her foot. The pain was excruciating, getting worse by the minute. Her foot swelled and got blacker and blacker and kept spreading fast. Her stepmother, bless her heart, knew something had to be done quickly. She had several chickens brought to the door, killed one at a time, split it open, and bound it immediately over the bite. The warm chicken drew the poison out, and Grandma's foot got better again. In 1865, Thomas moved his family to Tocqueville from Santa Clara, and he made this their permanent home until death called him home at the age of 86 years. While the family were still living at the mill, the Indians became so hostile that it was thought best to send the four younger children, Mary, Tina, Joe, and Will, to live at Tocqueville, and my grandmother, Mariamne, now 16, was sent to care for them. In all probability, she must have been quite charming, for the young mail carrier looked with favor upon her, and he must have been her first beau. That spring a neighbor came and invited Mariamne and the four children to come look at his tree, which was loaded with apricots. They were to look, but not to touch. They looked so temptingly delicious that Mariamne asked what she could do to get enough for the children to taste. He said if she would spin a pound of wool for him, he would give her a dozen apricots. This she did, and in later years her sister Tina said she had eaten many apricots since then, but never had any ever tasted so delicious as those first few. On the mountain, Thomas and his wife Mary and children used to gather choke cherries, elderberries, and service berries, and dry them and prepare them for winter. Fruits were very scarce, and they had to make use of everything that could possibly be used for food. They also scalded and peeled and dried small tomatoes for use in the winter. Once they recalled that all they had to eat on the mountain was potatoes and corn. Grandmother's formal education was very limited, a few weeks here and a few weeks there, but no record of where, when, or how much was ever found. However, she wrote a nice hand and was an interesting reader. Her skill in the kitchen and with the needle was well developed in her early teens. The highlight of her older sister Bell's wedding seems to have been the dried peach pie, which their stepmother made from peaches purchased from Bishop Thomas Willis at 50 cents a pound. No doubt a pleasant relief from the rhubarb pie made from sourdough. Sisters Nettie and Belle, both now married, lived in Salt Lake City. They were good friends to a newly arrived Canadian by the name of Charles Seegmiller, who with his mother Anna Eve, sister Amelia, and brother William had a farm on the Jordan River. They were anxious for their sister Mariamne, to come up from Dixie and meet him. They had told Charlie all about Minnie, and Minnie all about Charlie, and when they actually met, they became good friends, sweethearts, and man and wife in a short and beautiful courtship, for they felt for each other a binding and unselfish love which grew sweeter and more enduring with each year of its maturity. They were united in the old endowment house February the 1st, 1868, and after that Charlie's mother always made her home with Charlie and Minnie, and the three of them got along very well together. In 1867, William and Adam, Charlie's brothers, were called to the Muddy Mission, and in 1868, another brother, Dan, and Charlie were called to the Dixie Mission. They had worked very hard on their Jordan property, and of course hated to leave it, but felt it their duty to go where they were called. They hoped to sell their farm. It was now yielding, but since that land in that area was generally considered poor, they were unsuccessful and had to leave, realizing nothing for their property and hard labor. Charlie and Dan traveled south together, arriving in Cedar City late in the fall of 1868. They had an order on the Cedar City tithing office for flour, but the streams were frozen so that the mills couldn't run, so they had to take wheat instead of flour. There were no sacks available, so the wheat had to be hauled loose in one of their wagon beds. This meant that all the provisions of both families had to be piled into one wagon and the other loaded with wheat. They went to Tokerville, to where Minnie's parents, Thomas and Mary Forsyth, lived. The end of that journey must have been a welcome one for Minnie, as she was expecting her first baby in the spring. The men finally got the wheat ground at the Virgin Grist Mill, so that they had flour for the winter. Grandpa Charlie said that there was nothing in that settlement to feed their weary horses except a few frozen stalks of corn. Charlie helped Dan establish a tannery at Leeds. Their father, previous to his death, had a flourishing tannery and leather business in Stratford, Ontario, Canada, and brothers Dan and Adam had learned the trade under their father's directions. Apostle Snow decided the wise thing to do would be to establish the tannery in St. George. So he recalled Adam, who better understood the curing of the leather, from the Muddy Mission to work with Dan in St. George, and sent Charlie, a farmer, to the Muddy to take Adam's place. So again, Grandpa and Grandma left their land in Leeds and packed up and moved to a new land and began again. They worked hard in trying to make a success of the St. Joseph settlement. On the first day of May, 1869, much to their joy, their first child, Charles William Jr., was born. About this time, Minnie had just finished tailoring 2 fine suits, but Charlie's brother, Will's, pants were worn out. There was no stores in which to buy a pair of Levi's or bib overalls, and no cloth available to purchase. But before leaving Salt Lake City, a lot of sheep froze to death, and Minnie, though a young bride, pulled the wool off of them, corded and spun it, and wove it into 2 pieces of cloth, dyeing one piece one color and the other another. From them she had made Charlie and Will a nice suit of clothes each. She brought what was left of each piece of cloth with her when she came. This cloth was truly a blessing, as from it she made her brother-in-law a pair of pants, one part one color and one another, but good old-fashioned homespun. Gila, their second son, was born January the 7th, 1871. Their joy this time, though, was overshadowed by the tragedy of once more having to leave their land and home in St. George. Through an act of Congress, the boundaries of Utah was changed, and part of the land was given to Arizona and part to Nevada. This meant that St. Joseph was now under Nevada law. Nevada demanded a tax of $7.50 per capita, compared to 51 cents in Utah. Also, Nevada demanded back taxes. No one had money to pay, excepting Charlie and Minnie, who had boarded the mail carrier. So President Brigham Young advised the 600 saints to turn their backs on their fields and homes and find homes for themselves elsewhere. Gila was but 2 weeks old when Grandpa and Grandma, Charlie and Minnie, left St. Joseph. Grandma walked up the steep hills carrying the baby and helping little Charlie, not quite 2 years old. Little Charlie had canker real badly, and so did his little dog, so when they stopped to rest, she had 2 mouths to doctor, Charlie's and the dog's. Grandma and Grandpa stayed in St. George after leaving the Muddy. Most of the saints went elsewhere. A third son, Edwin D., was born October 4th, 1872, in St. George. He must have been a trial to raise in those days. As he was so frail and delicate, they often had to take him to the window to see if he was still alive. In 1873, they left St. George and moved to Sevier County. Here Grandfather worked in the tannery in Glenwood and helped make canals there. Then they joined the United Order in Prattville, where Grandpa was head of the Teamsters. They had a nice 2-roomed log house there, remember, because Grandma kept it so neat. One Christmas that my Uncle D remembered well at Prattsville was the year his parents made wooden horses on platforms with wooden wheels. They had real horsehair manes and tails and straps to pull them by. They were hidden under the table, and Christmas morning the boys were told to pull the straps, and to their delight out came the horses. Then fourth son Frank was born September the 28th, 1874. Later they had another baby boy, which died shortly after he was born. The family remembered well what a great hunter Grandfather was, and what a tidy housekeeper and good cook Grandma was. Everything had to be ironed. Underwear, sheets, dish towels, their stockings, each and all had to be ironed with hand irons heated on the stove. Julia Isabella, their first daughter, and my dear mother, arrived March the 12th, 1877, at Prattville, Utah. How delighted they must have been, their first daughter, after 5 sons. But when she was but 6 weeks old, once more came the need for them to leave their well-established home and their many friends, for Grandma's home was the gathering place for the women of Prattville. Grandpa's aging mother in St. George now needed care, and Grandpa and Grandma felt it their duty to leave the order and return to St. George to care for her. Grandpa always said that they left the order with 5 children, a poor team, a wobbly wagon, and 1 cow which they tied behind the wagon to make the journey. The trip back to Dixie must have been a long, tiring, and dusty one, but it meant they would at least have a settled home from now on. Grandma kept the children's spirits up as best she could, and oh, how happy the thought as they came over the point of the red hill, for they would soon be to their Grandma's house. Their reunion was a joyous one. The family moved into Charlie's mother's home with her and an orphan girl whom she had raised. The children remembered how their mother always had a real nice meal ready for their grandmother when she came home from the temple. They would stand by the gate and watch for her to come, and then gleefully yell, "Here comes Grandma!" On February the 16th, 1879, Anna Eve Knechtl, the aged mother, passed away and was buried in the St. George City Cemetery. The family stayed on in the old home, and the following year, February the 13th, 1879, Anna Eve was born. Grandpa was very busy now establishing a farm in the Washington fields. Grandma helped him and worked by his side, as well as cared for her ever-increasing family. Florence Bell was born the 2nd of March, 1881. She was never well, and Grandma gave her such tender care. She made spiritual broths for her and foods and tried to build her health and strength up, but it was in vain, and she passed away December the 5th, 1882. Next, Minnie was born November the 17th, 1883, and Leila Fern on December the 14th, 1885. Grandpa suffered so much with the heat that in the summers, for several years, he had to go to his brother Dan's creamy in Upper Kanab and work. But Grandma was adequate to the situation of taking full charge of affairs in his absence. Seeing that the garden was well taken care of, that the older boys' work went along smoothly at the farm in Washington Fields, as well as at home, she kept all the children home evenings by reading to them stories from the Bible, and later Ben-Hur and Quo Vadis were among the books she read. While her husband was away, she sold garden produce, vinegar, molasses, honey. She made barrels of brine cucumbers for sale. Charlie brought home cheese as part of his summer pay, some for the family and some to sell. Their cellar was always well stocked with crocks of preserves, pickles, fruits, sauerkraut, sausage, hams, dried corn, and other foods for the family. She prepared excess for the many guests she always made welcome under her roof and at her table. She told her children there must always be provisions for those less fortunate than we are. The school teachers' fees were paid mostly from sales from her garden, and she saw that a strict tithing was always paid. She always marked 1/10 of her garden rolls for tithing, the very best, and they were never touched by the family. She was a wonderful game, meat, and vegetable cook, and anyone fortunate enough to taste her cherry pie will always carry the memory. A son, Daniel Adam, was born December the 12th, 1887, at St. George, and George Harmon, June the 15th, 1890. By this time, she and grandfather began to move into the 160-acre farm in the Washington Fields in the summer and back in the winter. Now, because of their persistent and hard work, they owned one of the finest farms in southern Utah. They were great friends and loved and enjoyed their neighbors, as well as did they the Indians. One day a young squaw with her first papoose came to visit grandmother. It was only a few days old, but was bedded in ruffled up cedar bark. Grandmother couldn't bear to think of a tiny new baby in all those slivers. She carefully bathed the baby and dressed it in some of her own dainty baby clothes and shawls. She also had unpleasant experiences with Indians. Old Toby, a big buck Indian, came to her home and demanded the money from his squaw, which grandmother had just paid her for helping her wash. The squaw refused to part with the money. Toby, drunken, was angered by the refusal, made a lunge for the squaw. Although he had murdered several people, grandmother jumped in between them and held him by the throat until her grown son, who had heard the confusion, came rushing with some horseshoes in his hand. At this sight, Toby withdrew, and they sent one of the children for the marshal. Although grandmother was equal to any task presented by pioneer life, she could dance the heel and toe polka to the envy of any belle of the ball. Always most particular in her dress, she would not even in Dixie's son neglect to wear her corset. Marcia Jeanette, the last child, was born November the 12th, 1892. She was so small and dainty, the family always called her Dolly. Grandma never knew the help of a doctor with her 13 children. With such a large family, a tremendous amount of work, both at home and on the farm, was required. It could never have been accomplished without her systematic planning and regulating the work for herself and family. Saturday house cleaning and baking had to be done early, so that the bathing could take place in the afternoon in preparation for Sunday. A special Sunday dinner prepared on Saturday. She saw that her children were always present in Sunday school and primary, and clean and well-dressed because of her skillful sewing. She supported Grandpa in all his church duties and took special delight in any performance and activity of her children and helped and encouraged them in it. She was very thrifty and careful saver in her home. She taught willful ways makes willful want. She could make something useful out of apparently useful materials. And for her own children, by the light of the fireplace at night after work, she made not only rag dolls, but sawdust-filled dolls with china heads whose bodies she fashioned. She dressed the girl dolls in beautiful ball dresses, and the boys in little uniforms trimmed with stripes of narrow velvet ribbon. By the early 1900s, her older children were now choosing companions and marrying, and she was enjoying her grandchildren and in-laws. Some of her sons had filled missions. She and Grandpa could relax a little now, and they were planning on building the beautiful new home longed for with their life savings. On September 1911, when I was 6 weeks old, Grandpa and Grandma Seegmiller welcomed my mother, Julia Isabella Roundy, and her 5 children into their home, so my older sister and 2 brothers could attend school that winter, while my father prepared a home in the new town of Alton for our family to return to in the spring. I, of course, can't remember my grandmother, but I love to think that she kissed me and loved me, and that her kind hands helped my mother to care for me my first winter. In November 1911, Grandpa and Grandma were called as ordnance workers in the St. George Temple. People remember how well they performed their labors there. But in June of 1912, her failing health made it necessary for her to give up her temple duties, and on July 30th, 1912, she passed away. Grandfather continued many more years to do temple work, and never married, although he lived to be in his 104th year. She did not live in vain, for every day of her life she brought joy and wise counsel to those with whom she associated. Her friends were legion, and her memory sweet.